The idea of exploring the East Coast had always lingered in the back of my mind, like a wild fantasy waiting to be lived out. I'd seen the movies, heard the stories, and now it was my turn to dive headfirst into the madness. What I didn't realize was that this trip would be far crazier than I could have ever imagined, a whirlwind of mishaps, wild nights, and moments that would leave me questioning my sanity. I packed my bags with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, blissfully unaware of the chaos that awaited me. My adventure began in Boston, a city where history mingles with modern chaos in a way that only Boston can pull off. I arrived expecting some colonial charm, a bit of history, and maybe some good seafood. What I got was a full-on immersion into a city that seemed hell-bent on showing me its craziest side. My first night in Boston set the tone for the rest of my trip. I decided to join a ghost tour, thinking it would be a fun, spooky way to kick off the journey. The tour guide, dressed in full colonial garb, led us through the dark, narrow streets of the North End, spinning tales of restless spirits and haunted buildings. I wasn't particularly superstitious, but when we reached the old burying ground, I started to feel a bit uneasy. Just as the guide was describing the ghost of a Revolutionary War soldier who supposedly haunted the cemetery, I felt a cold hand brush against my neck. I spun around, heart racing, only to find nothing. No one was behind me. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling for the rest of the night. To shake off the creeps, I headed to a local bar, where I quickly discovered that Bostonians take their drinking seriously. I struck up a conversation with a group of locals, who insisted on introducing me to real Boston culture. Before I knew it, I was downing shots of whiskey and trying to keep up with their drinking games. Let's just say, Boston won, me 0. I stumbled back to my hotel in the early hours of the morning, somehow managing to avoid any major injuries, though I did wake up with a bruise on my shin and no memory of how it got there. The next day, nursing a hangover that could have felled a horse, I decided to take it easy and join a trolley tour of the city. Things were going smoothly until we reached the Paul Revere house. As the guide started recounting the tale of Revere's famous midnight ride, the trolley's brakes screeched, and we came to a jarring halt. It turned out that a group of enthusiastic tourists had decided to recreate Revere's ride on Segways. The sight of them zooming past us, shouting "The British are coming" in heavy accents, was so ridiculous that I nearly choked on my water. New York, New York, New York. Leaving Boston behind, I made my way to New York City, fully expecting to be dazzled by the bright lights and fast pace. What I didn't expect was just how intense, overwhelming, and downright bizarre my time in the Big Apple would be. My first day in the city was like stepping into a fever dream. Times Square was a sensory overload, flashing lights, blaring horns, and street performers vying for attention. I was barely able to take it all in when I was accosted by a man dressed as Elmo, who insisted I take a picture with him. I figured, why not? But after the photo, Elmo demanded a $20 tip. When I refused, he ripped off his mask, revealing a very angry, very sweaty man who started shouting obscenities at me. I made a hasty retreat, vowing never to trust a costumed character again. That night, I decided to take a break from the madness and explore Central Park. The park was a haven of peace compared to the chaos outside its borders. Or so I thought. As I walked along a quiet path, I suddenly heard a loud rustling in the bushes. Before I could react, a man dressed as a giant squirrel jumped out in front of me, screaming, "Welcome to Squirrelville!" I nearly had a heart attack. The man, clearly some sort of performance artist, offered me a handful of peanuts before scampering off into the darkness. New York, man. What can I say? But the real craziness started when I decided to check out the nightlife. I ended up in a nightclub that was so exclusive, I'm pretty sure even the bouncers weren't allowed in. Inside, it was like stepping into another world, neon lights, thumping music, and people dressed in outfits that looked like they belonged in a futuristic sci-fi movie. I tried to blend in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in way over my head. At one point, I found myself chatting with a woman who claimed to be a psychic to the stars. She offered to read my palm, and I figured, why not? But instead of a typical reading, she started ranting about how I was destined to become the next great political leader of the century. I was about to laugh it off when she suddenly grabbed my hand and whispered, "But first, you must survive the trials of the city." That's when I decided it was time to leave. After the madness of New York, I figured Philadelphia would be a bit more laid back. I was wrong. Philly had its own brand of crazy, starting with the fact that I arrived just in time for the annual Wing Bowl, a competitive eating contest featuring some of the most outrageous characters I'd ever seen. I found myself in a stadium surrounded by thousands of rowdy fans, all cheering on people who were shoveling chicken wings into their mouths at an alarming rate. The whole event was so surreal that I couldn't stop laughing. But Philly wasn't done with me yet. That evening, I joined a haunted pub crawl, thinking it would be a fun way to see the city's nightlife. We started at a historic tavern, where the bartender claimed to have seen ghosts on multiple occasions. After a few drinks, we headed to the next stop, a bar located in an old colonial building. As we made our way down a narrow, dimly lit staircase, I suddenly felt a cold breeze on the back of my neck. I turned around, but no one was there. Just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, the lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. The guide swore the place was haunted, and by the end of the night, I was starting to believe him. The next morning, I decided to visit the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall to get a dose of history. Everything was going smoothly until I somehow got separated from my tour group and ended up wandering through a restricted area. I didn't realize my mistake until I was approached by a very stern security guard who informed me that I was trespassing on federal property. I tried to explain that I had just gotten lost, but he wasn't having it. After what felt like an eternity of questioning, he finally let me go with a warning, but not before giving me a lecture on the importance of following signs. Lesson learned. Finally, I arrived in Washington, D.C., hoping for a bit of peace after the chaos of the previous cities. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the East Coast doesn't do peace. My first day in D.C. was spent touring the monuments and museums. I was in awe of the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, and the somber beauty of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Everything was going smoothly until I decided to visit the White House. I joined a group of tourists gathered outside the gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of the president. As I was taking a selfie with the White House in the background, I suddenly noticed a commotion at the gate. Secret Service agents were rushing around, and the crowd started to buzz with excitement. Apparently, the president was about to leave for an event. As the motorcade began to pull out, I tried to get a better view, not realizing I had stepped a bit too close to the edge of the sidewalk. Suddenly, I was shoved back by a security officer, who sternly warned me to stay behind the barrier. The next thing I knew, the president's car was rolling by, just a few feet away from where I was standing. My heart was pounding as I realized how close I had come to causing a scene. After that, I decided it was best to keep a low profile for the rest of my time in DC. But the city had one more surprise in store for me. On my last night, I decided to check out a trendy rooftop bar with a spectacular view of the city. Everything was going great until I decided to order a cocktail that came with a side of dry ice for that extra wow factor. What I didn't realize was that the dry ice was there for show and not for consumption. One sip, and I felt like I had swallowed a cloud. The bartender rushed over, informing me that I was supposed to wait until the smoke cleared. Oops. Thankfully, I survived the experience with nothing more than a bruised ego. As I boarded the train back to Boston, I couldn't help but laugh at the sheer madness of my trip. The East Coast had been everything I'd hoped for and more: wild, unpredictable, and full of stories that I'd be telling for years to come. From the eerie streets of Boston to the chaotic energy of New York, the haunted corners of Philadelphia, and the near miss with the president in DC, it had been a journey that defied all expectations. And as the train rattled down the tracks, I realized that travel isn't just about the places you go. It's about the crazy, unexpected moments that make life worth living. The East Coast had given me stories that would keep my friends entertained for years, and I couldn't wait to start planning my next adventure. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the best stories are the ones you never see coming. It would be nice if you like and subscribe to the channel so as to get more and more stories.